everybody. Welcome to our November Homeless Solutions Advisory Council meeting. Thank you for being here in person and those that are online. Welcome, welcome. Little different makeup today as we are in the work session room for the county because we have our listening session after this, which is fantastic. So we are going to dive right in because we do want to get to all the goodness that has been prepared for us so that we can be prepared at 5 o'clock for that listening session. Hopefully everybody has seen the agenda. I do want to do a quick reminder about public comment. Always open and welcome to public comment. It is limited during our meeting times. You can raise your hand in Zoom or in person if you're in the room. And written comment is always welcome, made through the public comment form on the Solutions Council website. And then if time permits, staff may remain after the meeting to address any questions or concerns that may arise. And anytime we get public comment, staff always does follow up on that. So do we have any public comment in the room or online?
Stop for that.
It's okay. I'm mixing up the two meetings. Thank you. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. So then we will just jump to updates, our staff updates. So staff, thanks for being here.
Good morning. For the record, Nicole.
Good evening.
Going back in time or forward, you know, your choice. For the record, Nicole Singh, she, her pronouns with Washington County. I have just a quick update if we want to move to the next slide before I turn things over to our Assistant Director, Jess Larson, with more of the meat of our updates. I shared this via email with members of this committee, but want to make sure you are all aware that I am leaving my role at Washington County. It's been just so fabulous to work with this council and really with Nadia build it up from scratch. So it's been very fun to work through the hard problems. I mean that genuinely, as we've brought hard conversations forward. There have been harder moments, there have been tense moments, and we've all worked through it with just such grace and respect and shared mission. So I've really enjoyed the time in this space. Wanted to share my appreciation for you all as a county staff person and also my appreciation as a resident of Washington County. I know I'll continue to watch both the department and this council do really great things. So much appreciation. I'm with the county until December 5th. And if you're interested in staying in contact, just reach out to me, find me after this meeting, and I'll be sure to share my information.
Nicole, it's been a joy to work with you and have you here in this county helping us build out our system with these SHS funds. So thank you for everything you've done and how you've shown up in this space and been with us on this journey for Solutions Council. You are going to be deeply, deeply missed.
Agreed.
We will miss you. Thank you for everything. I think we're turning it over to you, Jess.
Okay, well, before I dive into those details, there's no chance we're filling Nicole's shoes. You just transformed who we are, how we come to work together, and how we partner with our community and what we're capable of. So thank you. Thank you for creating a beautiful and solid foundation for this work to continue. And yeah, I deeply miss you, but I also know you'll be here next year giving public comment because that's your favorite thing to do. No, you won't go far, and you'll always be a part of the work. And once a Hauser, always a Hauser, we say. Thank you. All right, just some important updates from our kind of the funder roundup. As we shared last time, I believe, gosh, months move so quickly, so I'm not sure if we shared that in this space. But we are proceeding with an application to Oregon Housing Community Services, the state funder, to establish Washington County. We hope to establish Washington County as the regional coordinator for the new shelter program that the state has launched through newly available resources for shelters. Essentially, these are a continuation of dollars created one time under the governor's executive orders. So we will be sustaining our capacity, we won't be increasing shelter capacity, but as the coordinator, we will be able to strategically integrate resources across all funding sources. So that's an application underway. Nicole and her team have been leading, and we hope we'll be moving forward with good success. we have important federal updates that we continue to track. I just want to call your attention to this one pager that maybe at your seat, and if not, we'll pass it around. We'll be sure to include it in all of our materials. It outlines kind of all of the moving pieces, and we continue to update this document on changing programmatic policy and resource availability under the current federal administration. I'm going to go into detail about the continuum of care NOFA because that directly relates to your role here as our COC board. But before I go there, the other details are just, well, note that the federal shutdown was resolved, so the government is back in business. We were able to maintain rent payments out to all of our participants without interruption, and we'll continue to do so. We are continuing to struggle through likely ramping down of the emergency housing voucher program, which was new funding during the COVID pandemic that we had hoped would last until 2030, and this administration has decided to sunset it earlier, which will have potentially an impact on as many as 28 formerly housed homeless or at-risk households. So we are working to mitigate those potential impacts, connect them to other vouchers or housing solutions. And that is similar for the potential looming impacts of households with mixed status. Mixed immigration status is what that means. And we have, I think, about 39 households who are enrolled in our current programs through the Housing Authority, appropriately as defined by current policy through HUD to allow for mixed status households to be served in our programs and to prorate their rent so that the benefit is only for households with the necessary immigration status, not for households without that status. Unfortunately, we're anticipating that rule to change, not allowing those households to participate in our programs. And so there would be about another 39 households that would face similar impacts of having to find other permanent housing solutions. So we continue to say here in Washington County that we are lucky and grateful to have both the support of our board, our community, our partners, and the resources approved by voters that allow for flexibility for us to mitigate some of these impacts. So we hope that every household who faces a change in their voucher status because of the current administration's rulemaking will be offered something else equal or sufficient to meet their needs. That is work that the department continues to navigate. Nicole, any other features on our federal, before obviously not the COC?
Yeah, I might say that we don't have a bullet point on the slide here, but certainly the federal action came up quite a bit at the Housing Forum. I saw a number of you there. Thank you for joining us in that conversation. I'd be remiss not to mention that increased immigration activity is certainly impacting our providers, the people we serve, and want to call out the action of both our board of county commissioners and the city of Hillsborough in declaring an emergency and dedicating funding to support those communities. So certainly we're watching that as well, not directly related to housing, but impacting those we serve.
If there's any extra copies that didn't make it all the way around, I would love those.
At least one. Oh, and you as well? Two.
Oh, I gave mine. Okay. Great, thank you.
Our board, if you check our board's work, they had a work session this week on pending reforms that the Metro Council will be making to implementation of the SHS measure, the regional program that we are so blessed to receive resources to expand our system with. These changes are specific to governance structure, KPIs, or key performance metrics, how we measure our outcomes, how we're investing the RIF, the Regional Investment Fund, dashboard, and some admin rules. So there's 5 kind of reform elements that are outlined through the staff proposal that was discussed by their council and now has been discussed by our board. So you can look back and follow along with those meetings if you like. We have some concerns, or rather our board has expressed some concerns, and we'll be communicating that to Metro Council, but generally these are reforms moving us in a direction towards continued partnership and improved implementation to hopefully secure ongoing voter support when we have to remove the measure. So this is not the reform conversation of a measure going back to voters. It is reforms that can happen within the construct of the current measure and the IGA's clarity. So happy to point you in those directions if those you'd like to learn more of those materials, but that's just a general state of affairs on these elections. Congratulations to us all. We celebrated a beautiful Friday morning at the new Hillsborough shelter last week. Kim, your team was so wonderfully it was the space was vibrating with energy and anticipation of being able to run the new shelter program there. So it's really fun to see your team just glowing in this new opportunity. And of course, your words were profound and brilliantly portrayed the impact of the moment occurrences. Great celebration. We had our Senator Merkley and Congressman Bonamici with us, along with many other elected officials from across the state and region. But just another great, joyous occasion celebrating. This too program will sustain capacity, right? We're going to be closing down the temporary Cloverleaf shelter where we've been operating at the fairgrounds since COVID, my goodness. And but what is such a gain is a purpose designed program, a building that a whole and you can see this appeals. I'm sure Kim will speak there if you haven't had the chance to be on site, but a whole property design for being a welcoming, safe, and supportive place transition out of unsheltered homes to safe housing. So congratulations to us all and thank you. Good luck, Kim. Just kidding.
Same.
We have like 3 slides to go over the COC NOFO, but maybe I'll pause and see if there are any questions or other important add-ons.
You just said since COVID, and we moved into Cloverleaf. The tents were there August 3rd, 2020. So it has been a nice chunk of time. Good things happening.
All right, well, on the challenging things happening front, the federal administration did release the NOFO, which we have been anticipating and uncertain of what it would entail and how quickly we would have to be responding. And now we mostly know all the details, so here we go. This NOFO is required in order to continue receiving our COC funding in Washington County for the fiscal year 26. That starts as soon as January 1. We are lucky in that there won't be any impacts to any of our specific programs because their contracts start later in the year. But there are programs across the nation who are anticipating funding January 1st and have to first go through this very challenging and murky hoop of this application. There are 2 major changes to the federal administration's approach to the NOFO that we and maybe Katie is leading our team in strategically navigating. Essentially the objective here is to retain the funding for Washington County. It's about $5 million. But how we successfully retain that funding is all about how we successfully apply to this new application with new priorities. The significant shifts are first that only 30% of the resources in our application can be used for housing programs. In the past, COC has prioritized the vast majority of resources to go into housing. Housing is what is ending homelessness, as we all know. And so there was no limit, but now when we apply, only 30% of the programs, or 30% of our projects that we propose can be dedicated for permanent housing programs like PSH and refugee housing, which means we will have to figure out how to sustain the capacity that is currently funded. I think we're at about 85% right now. The other significant shift is that previously there's a structure in the NOFO called Tier 1 and Tier 2, but your priority projects are in Tier 1 and you can guaranteed that funding, and then Tier 2 is the competitive funding where your application that describes all the good things you do in your COC and all of your metrics and outcomes, that is the competitive part, and we compete against the rest of the nation for those resources. That used to be a 90% Tier 1 and a 10% competitive tier 2, this proposal requires that 30%, only 30% is in that tier 1 protected, and 7-8% will be competitive. And so what that means is we have to write a really good application to secure those 70% resources. But what we don't know is how the administration will be actually scoring, even though they've given us all the details and we will be submitting application according to our best abilities to comply with those recommendations. There are still some unknown features that could result in us being penalized. And so effectively the 70% is a bit at risk. So we will be doing our best and we'll be keeping you posted along the way. But those are the significant changes. Yes.
I've done a bit of work on it so far and saw that there's a lot of treatment requirements that go along with basically any requests. And one thing I just didn't know was from previous NOFOs, that is all new. Is that correct?
So this is where I probably should be seated next to my colleague Katie.
Yeah.
My understanding is that the requirement is new, and there is a way that we'll be able to leverage some existing programming to meet that requirement. However, the trick is that rapid rehousing and PSH can only make up 30% of our program, even if we have those requirements sustained. The other requirement that will be that is important for us to track is the SAVE requirement, the immigration status requirement. It's not a requirement we have in our other funding sources. So that limits how many programs that we can put forward for housing. So we'll be putting forward, that's what the 70% here describes as other places where we can think about transitional housing or supportive services, HMIS coordinated entry.
And so scope of the challenge, what percentage currently is going into permanent supportive housing?
95% goes into housing. They define housing as permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing. Okay. And in Washington County, that's 95% of our funding right now, about $4.8 million.
And now it's restricted to 30?
Correct. So in Washington County, that will be about $1.5 million.
So what is the other 70% going to be?
The other 70% is required to be focused on transitional housing, HMIS, coordinated entry, street outreach, or standalone supportive service only projects, with the majority of the Trump administration's focus being on transitional housing.
I want to reassure you all that we do all of those things, right? Yeah. And this application is $5 million of about $120 million system. So what we're going to be doing is figuring out how do we, yes, that's exactly.
I think if you want to go to the next slide, thinking through some of our thoughts.
Sorry. Next slide.
Can you send this? Was not in our slide package, was it?
No.
These slides were created and finalized today. We'll update the packet.
Thank you.
Those are just 2 slides.
3.
I'm sorry. And this is the.
Oh, just.
There's the strategy. Thank you, Nadia. All right. So, well, why don't go ahead, Katie?
So this is under development, but kind of as we were just chatting about, reducing and prioritizing our PSH projects. So between our PSH and our rapid rehousing projects, rapid rehousing can serve participants until they are completed with that program and not take new applicants. Versus our permanent supportive housing, our shelter plus care program is continuing to serve folks over and over again, year over year. So how we are currently thinking about this application is reducing our shelter plus care. It will still be about a reduction in half. Our shelter plus care is currently 61% of our funding. We would be shifting it down to 30% of our funding. And then identifying projects for the other 70%. So eligible renewal projects, we currently have 1 transitional housing project already in our COC funding. That's pretty rare across the country. So Boys and Girls Aid serves a transitional age youth transitional housing program. And then we actually have 2 supportive service only projects that go alongside our shelter plus care program that we would continue as renewal projects. And then we would have new projects that would go into that 70% focused on recovery. So if you haven't heard, we are opening a new transitional housing project focused on substance use at Cornell Road. So identifying that as a transitional housing project, which is pretty in alignment with this notice of funding opportunity, as well as offering if folks are interested in a work-focused transitional housing. And then HMIS and coordinated entry is currently not supported by our COC grants, but looks actually pretty similar to previous COCs. They haven't seemed to quite touch that in the notice of funding opportunity. And so it feels like a good opportunity for us to leverage that. Thank you.
So some of this is money that we're already spending, which then can be supplemented by this, and then we can move this. Okay, got it.
Yeah, so HMIS and coordinated entry right now is supported through SHS funding and some state funding. We have about $42,000 that is currently COC funded. So we would look to increase those funds and kind of do some switching around and better leverage state and SHS funding for rapid rehousing.
So will we do some of that leverage to keep Shelter Plus Care at 61%, or is that just a reduction?
It will still be, yes, we will be kind of leveraging SHS and state funding to do that right now. Most of our Shelter Plus Care, the services are I don't either. Services are actually mostly in-kind services funded through our behavioral health agencies. So the Shelter Plus Care is almost exclusively rental assistance funded by COC. The other, we're going to do some analysis of that to figure out how many households can we keep, because a lot of the our Shelter Plus Care are in place-based affordable housing projects. So it may not have as much of an impact household-wise because it's not as high of an expense because it's not as much general market renting in that program.
I'm mindful that we're still on updates and there is actually some presentation work ahead. Okay, so maybe we should. I'm sorry, I've overstayed our welcome, and thank you, Katie, for joining me, for bailing me out of presenting slides. I just and so you are our COC. Thank you. Yes, we agree. You are our COC board, so we will be bringing you in on this all throughout the way. But let's talk about what that path looks like. Nadia, if you could go to the next slide. The timeline is the other big news. We only have until January 14th. Usually, communities work for months on preparing for the NOFO. We've not been able to prepare because we've not known what it would be. And so we all started Friday, and here we go. What that means is as soon as we're back from our Thanksgiving breaks, we will be having an intent to apply meeting for all of our potential sub-recipients who would possibly interested in operating any one of those COC programs. Some providers already operate and would like to continue. Others may want to consider joining in on any of those proposed projects. Their proposals will be due back to us by December 14th. Then, as you recall, you seated a subcommittee to do the procurement in anticipation for this moment. So thank you. We are ready. They've already been contacted and getting ready to schedule them for either the 16th or the 17th to score those applications. Then we convene you for your next planned meeting, and you will approve, or you will consider and officially act on their recommendations as a subcommittee. And then we will need to convene you again one more time, and staff are figuring out how to do that, when and by what venue, before we submit the final and full application, just due January 14th. So that is a very expedited timeline. We're clearing all of our calendars to make time for staff to work on this very extensive application, leveraging as much as we can already in the works, and being as strategic as we can to sustain all programs with all resources while satisfying the funding requests.
I appreciate that, especially because COC, we've been able to care for our homeless families and our domestic violence. So yes, please do the best you can to keep that resource alive with other resources.
Thank you so much. The change in the the administration's priorities do not change our priorities here in Washington County. It changes how we continue to sustain this entire system of care,
Good.
including the programs that are currently operating that might not be eligible for.
Beautiful.
Nicely said.
Thank you.
All right, I believe that's all from us for this time.
Great. I am going to suggest that maybe subcommittee updates can be done via email. We could ask everyone, that would be wonderful, so that we can get to the meat, because time is of the essence. So that's what we'll do. So we are going to move to that annual reporting.
Well, here we are again.
Sorry.
Moving on to happier news, which is the completion of our annual report. We hope you have a copy. We brought extras for you to share and pass around to your neighbor or your mom or whoever you
I
want
have
to
mine.
impress. I have the wonderful job of just highlighting some of the annual outcomes, and then Katie is going to get us into the real meat and potatoes, as you say. So here are the highlights from our homeless services system. Specifically, though the annual report I'm referencing here is for the whole of the department. We also just completed our annual report to Metro for the SHS investments. So those outcomes are here, with 800 households placed in housing who were previously homeless. 800 previously homeless households. Yeah, that's right. 1,100 who were supported with eviction prevention or other case management supports to sustain their housing. 3,100 people who moved through one of our shelter programs, one of our 400 plus beds. That's incredible. And then does that say second time from shelter and outreach? So those are outreach teams, and our shelter beds helped people move through the system towards something more stable. And then opening the doors in 3 of our new capital projects. A very exciting year of accomplishments. Next. And these are some of those outcomes from the whole of the department. So putting together our federal rent assistance resources, our state dollars, sorry, so touchy. These are the totals of all of those resources working together across the department in an integrated way. So you see that we've got 26 projects underway, and over 10,000 people in one of our long-term voucher programs. It's incredible. And I also want to call it an overarching outcome of 20,700 people served from any one of our programs in the department. We like to say that's as many as the people as the population of Sherwood. And today in a meeting, Emily asked, "Does anybody live in Sherwood?" And I said, "Does anyone else live in Sherwood?" Well, Kim, thank you for representing the city of Sherwood. All right, so just a tremendous year of accomplishment. And I think also the other accomplishment of this annual report, big shout out to Emily for her leadership in getting it through the finish line and off to the printer, is that it tells that integrated story of our resources from the federal, state, and local level, working across rent assistance, development, and supportive services programming, all overseen through our department. So we're really proud of this kind of first version of that integrated work. So I think with that, this is a map that illustrates that impact in a different way. So you can see all of the shelters and access centers listed out, but then also that list of regional affordable housing projects that have been created also through voter approved resources. And then I think there's other projects that are continuing to be supported by the county through our public housing authority. So you'll find all of that in the printed version, but I think we're going to dive a little bit deeper into our homeless services programmatic outcomes, and I think that's the next slide for Katie to dive deeper into the details for you all.
I'll run through these rather quickly. Let's go to the next slide. So as you can see, once we had our revised goals after the budget reduction projections and about this time last year. We ended up exceeding all of our work plan goals, serving, as Josh just mentioned, over 800 households into both permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, eviction prevention, sustaining our shelter goals, and then exceeding our housing retention goals, which we'll get into a little bit later. We also, one highlight for me, we served over 1,900 people in those 385 shelter beds, but we're still not meeting the need. For every 4 to 5 people that are calling and requesting assistance, we're only helping one individual. So I'm still seeing a really great need in Washington County and trying to respond to that need effectively. Next slide. The other thing I'll highlight is our local implementation plan. I know many of you have heard about, we are revamping our local implementation plan this year for years 6 through 10, and we've exceeded all of our goals in what our initial local implementation plan said. So continuing to hold these as our goals, but also creating a system that is now more responsive to where we are in year 5 than where we were before year 1 even existed when we wrote our first local implementation plan.
Can I just ask because it's not in here, I'm remembering it must have been a presentation, but someplace I saw that the numbers that Jim's been asking for, how many came in, how many went out, and how many were not served.
It's coming.
Oh, sorry.
Can I
Yeah,
just-
I saw it.
Can I just say that the SHS Oversight Committee, I won't give an update, but they were just amazed that you're doing an LIP, and every county was encouraged to do the same thing, because they're not the same as they were before. So congratulations.
Nicole and Jesse. Want to talk a little bit about our partnership and capacity building, and we'll go to the next slide. A couple of highlights on this. We're continuing to elevate the work of our culturally specific organizations, and I'll get back to that in a few minutes. But we also launched our RUT tool, which is really looking at equity and evaluating all of our policies and programs through an equity lens. We've already deployed that multiple times this year and continue to do that, as well as implement it across the department, both on our housing and homeless services. Continuing to also uplift our Asian population and the lack of representation we're seeing in our system. And so we've hired a Hatfield Fellow this year to specifically do focus groups and interviews to better understand why folks aren't seeking out services specifically within our Asian population. Next slide, talking about our culturally specific providers. We have a pretty broad stroke of folks who are represented as far as demographics go. Many speak a different language, 73%, and about 40% have lived experience. One of the highlights I want to share here is of our culturally specific providers, they are some of our highest paid workers, which is a really exciting, let's go to the next slide. That we are continuing to see that they are showing up and continuing to see higher wages in our culturally specific organization. We launched our culturally specific organization cohort this year, and they've already met, or actually at the end of last year, and they've continued to meet throughout this year on an every other month basis. They're really elevating a lot of the things that we're responding to right now that Jess and Nicole shared in staff updates, and continuing to hear from them how we can support them specifically amongst what is happening right now in Israel and across Western Washington. And then continuing to look at capacity building. So many of our organizations received capacity building grants and are continuing to spend down those capacity grants into this upcoming fiscal year as well. Where do we spend our money? Most of our money is kind of in that biggest pot, that left mid blue color, specifically on permanent supportive housing. That is both the supportive services and the rental assistance related to permanent supportive housing. Our next biggest pot of money you'll see is that built infrastructure. So that's all of our one-time funding. As Jess mentioned, all the amazing capital projects that we've been operating, 26 so far, is a really big win. That is one-time money that won't continue to be spent over time. So many of these other pockets are spaces where you'll see our expenses be kind of consistent over time. The other big highlight I want to pull out is that $8.3 million on prevention. We are continuing to see that go down. We spent over $8 million last year on prevention, and we've since reduced that down specifically going into this next fiscal year. to jump into data and inflow and outflow. So as Jim mentioned, over 9,000 people inflowed into our system last year. Those are folks mostly coming in through coordinated entry. I'll get to that detail on the next slide, but we're still continuing to see more people coming in expressing need for our services than exiting our system. You'll see on the bottom outflow, many of our folks are being placed into either system placements, so rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, or other positive exits. Those would be folks that potentially be paid move-in only, like a one-time funding, or positively exited either to friends and family or rent on their own. There's many different options. We do still see quite a bit of folks who call into our system and then they're an unknown disappearance. So they don't call back for assistance. They called into Community Connect and then never show back up into the system. And we're continuing to evaluate who are those folks. Do they only show up one time? Are they continuing to show up time after time? And evaluating how do we better serve those folks when in their one moment of crisis they call us and not necessarily are showing up kind of month over month in our system and being served by street outreach or shelter. As you can see, majority of the folks that come into our system are coming through a coordinated entry. So that's either through a phase 1 assessment. Majority of those phase 1 assessments are completed by our Community Connect phone line. And far fewer coming in through shelter or street outreach. But we're continuing to have a large number of folks that are unserved month over month and year over year because of the volume of need comparatively to the number of places that we have in our system.
Thank you so much for this data. This is really important. I would hope that we would be able to get this data on a more than annual basis. And whatever information we might have about who's coming into coordinated entry would be helpful in figuring out what we need to do.
Yeah, I agree with James. I think it will be so important and more clear for us how many people come in as increasingly homeless more than a year, at imminent risk, and then see how we can probably target the resources, knowing the data is more visible in that way. I thought that was the next. I was like, oh, we're gonna see how many people call in, just become homeless yesterday or a month ago or 3 months ago or 12 months ago. Because that also says a lot about affordability and other systems that needs to be in place.
Rachel, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. A couple things I'm thinking as I'm looking at this data here. One of the things I'm thinking about is I would love to see, especially for something like this, what this looks like for the whole region. And if, there's duplication between the counties, I'm just curious to know that. And then the other thing I'm thinking about, my dream would be that bottom bar, that total unserved bar gets shorter and shorter and shorter as time goes on. And if it doesn't, I think what that doesn't speak to the work that organizations are doing, that just speaks to problems and the systems that surround us. So I just those are the thoughts I'm having. Thanks.
I think it's critical to see this. So thank you, Jim, for keep pushing this. And you're right, we need to see it more often than just annually. And I think for me, part of the realization with that bottom number is figuring out the entire continuum of care, not just SHS funding, but what other resources are out there for us. Because as this funding has proven, it's incredibly volatile and we don't know what's going to happen with it. And it's not the silver bullet for all, ending homelessness here in Washington County. And so I just want to at least lay that again, that I know I need a better understanding of what else is available that we could be utilizing. Drew, give us a spot right here. So, see, they wanted us next to each other. That's how it is. Yeah. So that's just something that does for me as well is that continued reaching out of what other services are available that we can be accessing to find solutions for the clients that we're privileged to serve.
And to restate the obvious, and this is what happens in the SHS oversight, when we present to the public at some point in the future, people need to know this, you know? It's not, who said it, it's not a reflection of the work that you're doing, because the work you're doing is fabulous. It's a reflection of something else, of what's happening in the world.
Staff are working right now as we speak to get this on a more regular basis. So working on both kind of how do we further refine this and describe it. You'll hear, I've heard a couple of Metro oversight committees where they said for every X number of people leaving, we have this number of people coming in. And so that's the number we want to have for Washington County to describe for every number we're exiting into reunification with family and friends and housing and all of those things. We still have more coming into the system and needing services. So we're going to continue to refine that number and describe that number and also continue to track this on a more regular basis. We're looking at ideally monthly, but to start quarterly.
Good.
Then go to the next slide and give you all time to ask more questions as I get through this. Housing retention, our goals are 90% retention. We saw slightly lower for our ARLA only and EHB programs, but a 91% retention for PSH and a 96% for rapid rehousing. You also saw on the right side, returns to homelessness. This is going to be anybody that exits to a permanent destination and then returns to homelessness. So you'll see higher returns to homelessness for programs that are shorter term temporary programs. Many of those programs are self-resolving programs, so they may come back into the homelessness system because there was less touch points by our system.
Same probably with the 88% of ARLA only.
ARLA only is going to be folks who anybody who is in ARLA only first went through our supportive housing programs. The table. So most of the folks that are returning are actually from our EHP programs. In this statistic, we haven't had that many people exit from ARLA only as we start to build up that program.
Oh, okay. Because I was gonna say, well, then maybe they were not ready to be at ARLA. Okay.
As we're looking at demographics across all of our different programs, you'll see higher rates of Latin and Black individuals served in our programs that comparatively to rates of poverty, which is really showing that this is working. And I'm really excited to see that the way that our homeless system is really reflecting the people being served and that we are serving a wide and diverse group of folks in our system. We're still seeing some disparity for Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, and also those percentages are significantly lower in our community. And it's something our Hatfield Fellows continue to look into and figure out how we serve better.
For this graph, it'd be really helpful to see total demographics for Washington County as well, because that's telling us story, but I'd like to see it compared to the rest of the population of the county as well.
That's interesting, Drew. Sorry. We use the percent of the population of Washington County who's living below poverty. So specifically, our services track the rate of poverty in the general population, but not the general population as a whole, because poverty impacts different racial groups differently. That is, I see what you're describing, the added benefits in different ways.
Oh, that's helpful to understand that definition too, though.
Happy to answer any questions or go back to slide one.
This is beautiful. The below poverty population, the house population of the people served should always be above the overall poverty, and seeing how other races, we are moving the needle where we should be. So this is beautiful, and then it is, the work of our cultural specific organizations, and also hiring people of BIPOC communities into our non-specific organizations community. Yeah, this data is very colorful and I love to see. colors.
Huge shout out to Heather. I heard Heather on the line. Because a lot
Thank you, Heather. You're amazing. Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah. Any questions online? Okay, I think we'll go ahead and adjourn our regular meeting and take a short break before the LIP listening session begins. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here online or in person. This is a public hearing for the Homeless Solutions Local Implementation Plan. A little bit of information to share with folks, and then this group is going to get really quiet. Our goal is to hear from you, listen to you, to take active notes, and then we will work with staff for feedback and more understanding and making sure that messaging about this important plan gets out there. So first on our agenda is a report from our staff. So Jesse.
Hi, everybody. Jessie Adams. I work on the strategic projects team at the county, and we are here today to get feedback from the community on the local implementation plan. A little bit about what that is. Part of the supportive housing services measure that passed in 2020. It's a regional fund, and it was part of the goal, yes, to have a regional approach to homelessness, but also very much included the recognition that all three counties, Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington, have very different needs. And so they wanted each county to create a local implementation plan to show how we were going to use this funding to address the homelessness crisis in our specific county. So that's what the local implementation plan is. And part of, again, baked into the measure is the importance of hearing from community how we do that work. It is our guiding light towards how we use this life-changing money to address the crisis in our community. So we use the plan to update our plans and our budget, because as amazing as $120 million is, it is not the cure-all. So when we don't have enough money to address everything, what do we do? How do we use that money to best address the issues in our county? We are really, really thrilled to be able to do this public hearing today. It is crucial to provide these spaces to be able to hear from folks and learn and adjust and just really make these programs work as best they can for our community. So we are really, really grateful to everybody who's here today to provide comment, and we hope to continue to do this in the future.
Thank you, Jessie. And I've been in a couple spaces with Jessie as she's come to present about the local implementation plan, and it's been awesome, including yesterday with the chart committee in Tigard. Kim Hahn was there as well. So thank you for your time and energy, making sure that you're hearing the voices of the community around this plan. So how public hearings work. We are here today to listen to testimony about the LIP. If you are interested in commenting on the LIP, please sign up with staff at the sign-in table or online. Click on the link to chat. We will call folks up to provide testimony in the order received. Each commenter will be asked to state their name and given 3 minutes to speak, and then you will not be interrupted. And we are really asking to stick onto the topic of the LIP. And we're here to listen. Again, it won't be a lot of engagement from us, but our goal is to listen to those that choose to give comment today. So we know we have at least one person signed up that we're excited to hear from. And Anna, we're glad you're here. Thank you for showing up, and you are welcome to begin, and we will give you 3 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Hello, everybody. And good evening. My name is Anna Kernitsky. I'm the Executive Director of Community Warehouse, your local furniture bank. And before I dive into my recommendations on the LIP, I just want to express my gratitude to you all, our Washington County partners, and just share that our supportive housing services contract with the county has been really transformative. In 3 years, we've increased homes furnished by 36%, eliminated wait times entirely, guaranteed beds for every household, and freed over 20 of our partner agencies from billing burdens. This partnership works, and it's making a real difference in people's lives as they transition out of homelessness to pick out their furnishings that transform empty rooms into functional, comfortable homes where they can rest, study, play, host, and dream. So today I'm here to encourage us to take another step to integrate furniture bank services into the LIP. Furniture is currently missing from the county's LIP framework, even though it's a critical component of successful housing placement and retention. So we flagged 3 potential integration points that we did share in more detail with the Department of Housing Services at Washington County. So I'll just summarize here. First, redefine supportive housing placement to include furniture. Let's be explicit, supportive housing should also be furnished housing. Second, define furniture as an eligible housing barrier cost. When someone can't afford a bed, a table, or basic kitchen supplies, that can be a barrier to housing stability and success. And third, explicitly include furniture under supportive services. The LIP states that supportive services, quote, help people achieve stability and live with autonomy and dignity, end quote. And that's exactly what furniture does. So yeah, council members, we know that investing in furnished homes works. I'm asking to formalize that commitment in the LIP so every person housed has the basics they need. Furniture is really not an extra, it's a foundation. So let's make sure this plan reflects that. Thank you for your continued partnership and for considering these recommendations.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, so for folks online and in the room, we are just going to kind of mute and hang out and see if anybody else shows up in person or online to make comment. So we will just kind of be here to wait and see. Just kidding. Sounds like we might have a written comment.
I'm gonna just okay. Do you want me to
It's true. So we do have a written comment. We don't have to share who it's from. Okay. As someone who has been working with SHS funded programs, my comment today is about being a worker in homeless services. And as a member of the Tri-County Planning Body, we need Washington County to take the lead within the metro region in addressing the workforce in homeless services. This industry, like behavioral health, can do incredible work when hiring folks with lived experience, and that experience is meaningful and needed. But it often comes with the additional need to train up this workforce to be an equitable footing with their workforce peers who may come from academic or other training backgrounds, or even some combination of it all. Like myself, a decade of lived experience in housing instability and escaping unsafe living situations, the years it took obtaining a college degree and then an advanced degree, and then years working in the field pursuing professional development at every opportunity. But none of that contributes, honestly and unfortunately, to the pay available to the people who work with homeless services, especially those who deliver direct services. Not only have we underfunded homeless services, we have underfunded the administrative costs to deliver these services. Paying a housing wage with the workforce earnings enough to afford their own housing is critical to maintaining and preventing turnover in homeless services. Our workforce is, thank you, susceptible, wow, big words, susceptible to compassion fatigue and being yes, sir, yes, ma'am types who overwork themselves because they have been on the receiving end and want to be there for the people who need these services. Washington County has to be a majority stakeholder in the process and work collaboratively with their community partners to create contracts that provide more funding to pay the staff agencies have to hire. There is no other way. Agencies have always and continue to do what they can to develop the funding needed to pay their staff, but it's bare minimum reimbursement contracts that underdeliver when it comes to supporting the staff needed to deliver the key performance matrix the contracts require. Budgets are moral documents, and I ask that Washington County take the time when redeveloping their local implementation plan and hopefully also the intergovernmental agreement in due time to add a priority of workforce wage equity. Thank you for that comment. Okay, so I think those are our comments so far this evening. We will still just kind of hang on for a little bit and be here if anybody else shows up or online. Hi all, us again. We have Jessie sitting with us, and it just felt like an opportunity to hear more about the spaces that she's been showing up in to talk about the LIP. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie for a little bit of an update, kind of putting you on the spot here. So I apologize for that.
So most recently, I've been focusing on reaching out to the jurisdictions. So as Kim mentioned earlier, I was at the chart meeting in Tigard yesterday. I am going to the Beaverton Call My Name meeting in the next couple of weeks to do the same thing there. I'm working with Hillsborough to find a space to do the same thing for that jurisdiction. We've continued to do outreach to funding or national partners. I think Nicole has spoken with HUD and the BEA. We've also done internal outreach to our partners at HHS in particular. Again, looking towards kind of that long-term multi-fund funding and all of that stuff. Trying to think what else we've done. We've done it really, again, internally with all the different divisions in our department, right? Like what exactly happens in our program implementation branch, contracting. We went to the SHS Oversight Committee recently to give them an update. We're going to the board in January. Do not have this all written down in front of me. I have such a good spreadsheet with all this information. Hisson, thank you. We did a presentation there. Lived experience and resident advisory board. We had their first ever joint meeting of those two groups, and that was really really helpful. It was a long meeting, and they had such impactful things to say. So that was great space.
So all this information that you're collecting, how is it going to be shared?
So the next step, I am working with BNF of our community engagement team to create an engagement report. So that'll gather not only a list of all the places that we've been, the focus of that space. If you remember the presentation I gave months ago, probably not. We kind of divided it into like advisory spaces, community spaces, partner spaces. So we'll have really the main output I'm looking to do is themes that we heard, what spaces we heard that in, and then eventually I'll take that table from the engagement report and we'll include it in the LIP. This actually was a really great suggestion from the oversight committee to say where exactly in LIP you can see that feedback show up. So that's my next step, is to take all of the feedback and kind of distill it into an engagement report, and then we'll bring that update to the board and have all of our kind of alignment and move forward to a first draft of it.
And then there's a survey that's still open.
There is a survey that's still open that will be open to the end of the month. Feel free to hang that flyer up. Like share that flyer outside. I can also send a link if that's helpful. And you can just share that via email.
That would be great.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Everybody, welcome back. We are close enough that we are going to call it, but Nadia, you did have one announcement.
I just want to point out that we are meeting next month. I believe it's the 18th. We also additionally have the luncheon. We're doing it the 17th, which is based on the feedback that we got from our survey. I will send that information out by email, so it's on your calendars.
Perfect. Hannah, thanks for sticking it out with us. Thank you everybody for being here, and we're done. Have a great night.
Go team.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Thank you.